We've heard different approaches, and we've seen that there's been a process of change in many of them. And so this leads us into our next presentation. A really interesting study that you'll be hearing about is how a group of companies changed and became better performers, not only in MSDs, but in occupational health and safety in general. And so the presenter that will be talking about that is Lynda Robson, and she's a scientist at the Institute for Work and Health, and she's worked there since 1997. And Lynda started as a PhD in biochemistry, but saw the light and became more interested in occupational health and safety, and has worked in the University of Toronto's Department of Public Health Sciences. So she teaches occupational health and safety system management at Ryerson, and is a member of the technical committee developing the second edition of the Canadian Standards Association on Occupational Health and Safety Management System, CSA Z1000. And I will at this point put in a plug for Z1004, which is the workplace ergonomics that if you're not aware of, you might be interested in looking at, because it has a lot of good information. And Lynda's research interests include occupational health and safety, with a particular emphasis on the management of that, organizational change in occupational health and safety, and the evaluation of prevention programs. So, Lynda, if you could tell us a little bit about change, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So I've got the after lunch slot. Maybe I should grab the hula hoop. Would that be more entertaining? So this study, as you see, it's a multiple case study. We studied in depth 4 cases. They were systematically selected, as I'm going to tell you about. And our challenge, or our aspiration, was to find some commonalities across those 4 cases, with the hope that, okay, these are things that could be applied in other situations. And I think this morning there's probably some themes that you see already that are, cross-cutting. There's the senior management support, there's the champion, there's the integration into either into the business or into other types of health and safety. So that's what we were aspiring to do, to find those commonalities. And I'll share this with you. This is the first project of an ongoing program focusing on change in health and safety. There were several other members of the team involved in this, and the work was supported by WSIB and the Ministry of Labor. So I talked about commonalities. You will see that I'm going to be presenting it in the form of a model. I'm going to talk a little bit more about our methods of selecting the cases, gathering the data, so you'll know what underlies this model. I'm going to spend most of the time describing the 12 elements of the model, and at the end I will tie it back to the workshop themes. So we went about this by using a large extract of WSIB statistics that we had access to, so a decade-long extract. And we looked specifically for firms that had gone from being, relative to others in their rate group or industrial subsector, they had gone from being among the 50% with the highest claim rate to being among the 20% with the lowest claim rate over this decade-long period. They could have changed quickly, they could have moved slowly, because we were really interested in all sorts of change. And if we had found companies change just by accident, well, we would have focused on that. But what we found is actually, in the majority of cases, they were organizations that had made a focused effort to improve in health and safety. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. So we screened this data extract of, representing 2,600 firms that were 75 full-time equivalents or more. And we found 32 that had made that magnitude of change I just described. We approached them all, half of them talked to us, and 12 out of those 15, as I say, had made intentional improvement. So this became our pool of 12 breakthrough change cases. Organizations that had made large improvement in, they had made large intentional change in occupational health and safety performance. So as Richard mentioned, we were not just focusing on MSDs. We had selected them by their change in total claim rate, lost time and no lost time. And of course, MSDs did comprise a portion of those injuries, a substantial proportion. So we had these 12 cases. We had funds to only study 4 in depth, and so we went about selecting the 4 cases very strategically. We selected from diverse sectors, and the benefit of that is that, well, if there's some factors that are cross-cutting across these organizations from very different sectors, it helps us be confident that they can be generalizable to other types of workplaces, or a wide variety. That said, these work sites that we studied in depth ranged in size from 60 to 210 full-time equivalents. So, medium-ish. And they were a mix of unionized and non-unionized, which we thought was a good thing, again, for this generalizability issue. You'll see the first case here, metal products, they had a rather rapid change, and in the other cases, change was relatively slower. So we gathered data on site. We spent 2 days on site interviewing people at all levels of the organization. We reviewed documents and records. We asked for a tour of the work site, and we learned where they had made changes over the previous 10 to 15 years. We had Ministry of Labor records as well as the WSIB records. And we're interested in how and why did this change take place. We first reconstructed the story for each of the workplaces and then looked for the commonalities. So that's what I'm going to present now. This summarizes our model of change based on our study of these 4 workplaces. So it's and so 12 elements. I'm going to move through the model and tell you about the different elements. And you'll see there's an initiation phase that's pretty critical before changing to the outcomes of interest. And at the core of this, as we see it, there was a transformation of knowledge. So knowledge that had previously been external to the organization became absorbed and integrated. And we heard cases of that this morning as well. And what I mean by integrated, so it was more than just people being trained, but rather knowledge being embedded in policies, procedures, documents, the records they kept, health and safety and performance reviews, new practices for both the workers and management in terms of how much health and safety was in their communication practices, meetings, informally on the floor, and their hazard identification practices as well. So with this new knowledge, certainly there were multiple examples of decreased risk that ranged the hierarchy of controls from substitution to better use of PPE. And these changes were plausibly related to the decline in claim rates that we observed. So let's turn to the other end of the model, the initiation phase. So this knowledge, how did that get into the organization? To a certain, one route was through hiring. So in one of the 4 cases, there was a new person hired, someone who had college training in health and safety and brought that expertise with her. And in another 2 cases, they had very strong relationships with external consultants, both from the public sector and private sector. And in the 4th case, it was a mix of the 2. So not just knowledge was necessary. Resonating with this morning, we heard about champions. Well, for us, this is someone we called the knowledge transformation leader. And really, they really orchestrated this transformation of knowledge. So they, for example, interacted with that consultant who was external to the organization, and then they talked with the people that were necessary within their organization. So someone that's in the organizational learning literature called the boundary spanner. And we noticed that across the 4 cases, these individuals, and we see them as rather special individuals, they had competencies in at least 2 areas. They had fine organizational skills, so, they could organize meetings, they could write policies and procedures, they could do the necessary follow-up. But they also had really strong people skills. So we felt that when we met them, we saw it when they interacted with others, and others reported on it as well. And so they ended up with the trust of senior management that gave them the power to act, and they also had the trust of the workers. And these leaders, in fact, empowered workers, particularly the Joint Health and Safety Committee worker co-chair. And the third thing that needed to be there internally was organizational motivation. Big challenge. So motivation to improve in occupational health and safety. And this, in all these cases, was enhanced by an external influence. So let me show you how these factors played out. They were present in all 4 cases, but the way they played out differed in terms of sequence of events. So in metal products, they had actually, in a sense, been exposed to a dose of knowledge in the form of work well. Failed the first time, hired someone, HR coordinator who got them through the second time. But that new knowledge was never really integrated, never really transformed and exploited. The plant and the corporation had been becoming more motivated in terms of health and safety. It was certainly one of the dimensions of performance that they valued. But it really took an interaction with the Ministry of Labor to further enhance that motivation. The inspector visited the plant and found that some orders he had written 3 months prior had not been acted upon. They had fallen through the cracks. And he took the initiative to call corporate headquarters, which then leaned on plant management, which then took the additional step of hiring for the first time a health and safety coordinator. And she brought with her that college education I mentioned. And that's when breakthrough change really seemed to initiate in that organization. So turning to group homes, the second example I'll show you, it was a different sort of story. that person was already there in the form of an HR manager. Two policies existed. He had one in health and safety, one in return to work. His attention had been on more traditional HR domains up until then. But he had interactions with an HSA consultant, the organization that's now known as PSHSA, and through that interaction came to the realization that they actually weren't doing a very good job in health and safety. And this was in contrast to the aspirations of their organization, which was seeking to be an excellent organization. So at some point there was kind of a piggybacking of health and safety onto the general endeavor of seeking excellence. And another way it was framed within that organization is that the dollars that were being spent on WSIB surcharges could be spent on their clients, to whom they were very dedicated. And that consultant was also able to provide them with the specific health and safety knowledge that they needed to move forward. And so that's how the initiation factors came together in that organization. So for all 4 cases, these things were all present, though they came together in different ways. I talked about these 2 cases. If we look at the specific cases of what were so we talked about the Ministry of Labor, the HSA consultant, and for the remaining 2 cases, the external influences were different yet again, including customer requirements in the plastics industry. And if we were to map these to a topology that Vedung has developed, we could see that even in this very small sample, we're seeing sticks, carrots, and sermons, if you will. And so just to say there's a wide variety of motivators that can stimulate large change. So I'm going to turn to the remaining 5 elements. The first 3 have to do with process, and the remaining 2 to do with context. So first of all, organizational responsiveness, and I know this was mentioned this morning. We were able to see this for sure present in 3 of the cases. And in 2 of them, it was quite striking how it was described as being a catalyst, and a catalyst for employee participation, which for some organizations is a challenge. So here's the quote, I quote about this. The one-to-one contact with operators about their health and safety concerns, I think that is huge, and I don't think that can be overstated, really. Tess was really good at getting back to people and closing loops, and then getting more information from people. And you know, it becomes a cycle, right? Of people being willing to talk more and to expect more because they've gotten this much, they expect more. So this was really Tess, the coordinator, that was providing this responsiveness, of course with the support of the organization behind her. And we saw this in the second case I talked about. It was playing out on the Joint Health and Safety Committee, but the same idea of responsiveness. Positive social and psychological dynamics. So this is really a very broad concept, and we used it to label, summarize multiple examples of what we heard to be energizing interactions on the Joint Health and Safety Committee. So whereas the committee previously had been dry, boring, as they went through the process of breakthrough change, as it started to pick up momentum, there were descriptions about it being vibrant, that it developed the right energy. We heard multiple examples of workers being empowered by the knowledge transformation leader so that they took on new responsibilities in training, reviewing hazard reports, speaking up more. There were multiple examples of individuals just developing their range of skills through their involvement in health and safety activities. And we heard multiple examples of people being enthusiastic and passionate. So we have an image of this energy, and there's something in the management literature that's termed organizational energy, and people have developed measures of it. And even, as you may all know from your own experiences, you go to some meetings and you interact with some people and you feel energized, right? You're ready to take on those challenges. And then you go to other meetings and you interact with other individuals and it's almost as if your energy is drained. So there's a correlation of this energy with performance. So it's something we'd like to explore more in future research. And just to say, this knowledge transformation leader had a lot to do with these positive dynamics. Continuous improvement pattern, of course, that's something that you find within a management system, and there were elements of the management system encouraging this pattern, but I'd say it was more of an attitude of what next. We get rid of the issues and move on to the next issue. And there was a sense of dynamism about it. Like we say, we get the fire going, and so we've got to keep adding more wood to the fire, right? Turning to the context. 3 of these organizations were improving in operations. At the same time, they were improving in health and safety. And we can speculate that these actions could have contributed to the decreased risk. We don't think it explains all of the decreased risk, but it could have contributed and also contributed to a sense of momentum. And there were also indirect effects. So, for example, in group homes, they were seeking to be excellent, they were seeking accreditation, and that to meet those criteria, they needed to expand their emergency planning and adopt more of a management system approach, develop performance indicators and track them. And indirectly, again, in manufacturing, when there was less chaos, they had better control over the process, there was more time for safety. And as they became more disciplined in their processes, that carried over to health and safety. So that summarizes, oh, we have one more, sorry. The supportive internal contact text, last but not least. So in all of these cases, the context was supportive, and I mean there was senior management support, there were good employee management relations. So in some cases, they even preceded breakthrough change, and in other cases, they improved simultaneously. There was relatively low turnover, which had been a barrier in earlier days, and a maintenance group that was responsive to health and safety concerns and contributed to this organizational responsiveness. So this is a model of what happened in a supportive context. So I think if you didn't have senior management support, if you didn't have good employee management relations, the model might look different. That said, you'll remember we picked these cases out of a population, the one that, and we picked the cases that made the largest change. So it's intriguing that the ones that made the largest change had these positive dynamics in a supportive internal context. It's perhaps no coincidence that with that dynamic you can get there quicker than if it's a more conflictual situation. So, yes, we have 5 minutes. So I'll be interested, is that right? Yes. 5 minutes? Okay. So I want to touch on the themes of the workshop, so I think I'll skip this question, but I am interested in anyone's feedback about how the model fits with your experience or doesn't. So there may be opportunities at break later in the afternoon. But to touch on the themes, leadership and culture, so I'd just like to point out that in our model, this knowledge transformation leader was critical to change. And that individual was not usually at the most senior level. In the grocery store, it was the owner. But in the other 3 cases, it was someone more at the mid-size, medium level, the HR manager, a process engineer, a health and safety coordinator. And certainly there were workers taking leadership roles that were critical too. They took on their new responsibilities, as I talked about, and we also heard about them talking with their coworkers proactively, not as a responsibility passed on to them, but really just because they were so passionate about the topic. They couldn't help but say something. And then in terms of culture, we didn't analyze these data with respect to culture. People use that type of language in terms of culture change and talked about new norms, so that even, for example, on the night shift when no one was watching, that people were still working in a safe way. And just to flag, when I'm thinking about culture, I'm thinking about those not only the artifacts, the things we can see, the behaviors, the policies and practices, but those things that are more hidden, such as values and basic assumptions. So turning to the large category of process, tools, intervention, and I'd ask Catherine for a description of what that meant. And I think, as you'll find in the workshop, 4 of these elements. So we have the 3 process elements that I mentioned, and really that the integrated health and safety knowledge gives some of the so we talk policies, procedures, health and safety and responsibilities, fits into this theme as well. And there's one cross-cutting sub-theme, so it's buried within that positive social dynamics. And it's worth noting that in these cases, the Joint Health and Safety Committee either led change, that was really, in 2 of the cases, I would say they were the engine of change. So there was senior management support, but the committee was really that locus of creativity, persistence. They led the change, particularly the co-chairs. And in the other 2 cases, the committee really supported the change. So in the grocery store, the owner got things off the ground over the first 3 years, and then the committee was able to maintain it while he had more occasional involvement. As far as training, training occurred in all cases, and multiple examples of not just training workers, but also supervisors and that knowledge transformation leader. But our view on it is that it's a necessary component, but not sufficient. And I think the cases this morning illustrate that there needs to be a lot more than that going on. Because we want not only individuals to have new knowledge, but we want new organizational knowledge so that it gets embedded in those practices. And so when any individual leaves, those practices are still there. And I'd also refer to a systematic literature review that I led. And in this, we were reviewing the research literature on randomized controlled trials of health and safety training. Tended to be lower risk issues. So it'd be training versus no training control type studies. And at the end of that, we were able to recommend, yes, workplaces should still continue to train workers. So this type of training was mostly hazard identification and safe practices. And so yes, that type of training should still be continued, because there's evidence that it has, strong evidence that it has an impact on worker practices. But if you really want to have a large impact, you don't want to just do training alone. That more than that should be considered, which is consistent with our hierarchy of controls. And so that was based on our study and other reviews that have been done that have found little or no impact of training on health and safety outcomes. And in this review, we had a good proportion of them as MSD prevention training. And if you want to learn more about this project, within your folder that you received, there's an article from the Institute for Work and Health that focuses on the knowledge transformation leader. I hope there will be a published article in Safety Science later this year, if all goes well. And in the meantime, online you can find profiles of the 4 organizations. And you can also learn more about the Institute for Work on an ongoing basis with these links. So, thank you.